Okie dokie. Hello, everyone. Happy or Merry Liberation Day. It's the 2nd of April. Dis and Dat information, more critical theory in the 21st century. It's sort of a continuation of what happened yesterday. In fact, there'll be a little bit of repetition only because the author decided to, of course, rehearse some of the material from the prior article. And it's on the same topic, so who are we to blame him for doing that? It is his words after all. The point, of course, is to look at Friedrich Pollock's contribution to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, or the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, which eventually moved to the United States and became the New School, et cetera, et cetera. The theory of capitalism in the German economic tradition, historicism or ordo-liberalism, critical theory, and solidarism is the title of the collection, and it appears to be it's a colloquy of an interesting sort. It includes commentaries on each chapter by the other authors. Quite a ambitious little project, and if, as it were, very German, as it were, I suppose, by Peter Kozlowski, edited in the year 2000. The section I've chosen is section 3 of the Harry F. Dom's chapter because I've been interested in Friedrich Pollock and his conclusion that the effect of Friedrich Pollock's Marxist analysis on the Institute for Social Research, for whatever reason, good or bad, or however his emphasis on state capitalism is, it had an effect on Frankfurt School critical theory, and it manifests itself today in terms of our trying to understand what state capitalism is or isn't. And I suppose we'll have to follow that on much further. The idea, of course, is that state capitalism is what some people have accused the Soviet Union of being during a certain period, and also the People's Republic of China, among others. And in fact, as a research topic alone, is quite interesting. But for our particular purposes here, and since I'm attending a seminar on the critical theory working group that the critical theory working group is organized, it just seemed to me to be interesting, and this was part of their reading pack. To discuss Pollock, which hasn't been discussed yet. They've been discussing Adorno's position, I guess Horkheimer's position, on the idea of the role of rackets
in advanced capitalism. And clearly, on today, the 2nd of April, a racket is going on, considering that on March 6th, uh, Trump decided to do something with digital um, coinage that may benefit, let's say, from this little stunt today on Merry Liberation Day to you all. Anyway, Harry F. Dom's Section 3, Dividing the Labor of Criticizing Post-Liberal Capitalism. That is Friedrich Pollock, the Institute of Social Research. In 1924, I may not get to the end of this, so I already previewed the ending, and that is that Pollock, because of his own specific critical interests, particularly on the issue of state capitalism, may have affected sort of the trajectory, as it were, of some of the direction for the Frankfurt School. Now, that's an interesting argument. It is referred to in Martin Jay's book, um, somewhat obliquely, but I am going to have to go back and look at Martin Jay's histories on this matter to sort of square that away. But that's the way it appears to me at the present moment. And it is not a problematic element, considering that state capitalism was the dominant form, with all respect to both National Socialism, on which Friedrich Pollock spent time, uh, working from a research point of view. And is real. I mean, the book that he does is called Behemoth. Needless to say, that it's very Leviathan-like in that sense. Um, you can argue, and in fact, it is quite possible. And in fact, from the current state of history, we can say that uh, one of well, that's another story. But the idea is, of course, that the American economy was a kind of state capitalism as well. But you can argue that in many different ways. The more uh, trenchant, I think, application of the idea of state capitalism applies more largely to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Uh, Although, of course, Pollock is talking about National Socialism, the Nazis. Anyway, in 1924, the Institute of Social Research was founded under the leadership of Karl uh, Greenberg, um, a German socialist of the chair. The Institute, with an explicit orientation toward the systematic analysis of society, was designed to revise Marx's critique of capitalism and bourgeois society, and to utilize social research towards that end in the process. When the Institute opened in 1924, the general sense that led to its establishment was that Marxian theory was in need of rejuvenation. During the preceding year, Lukash's History and Class Consciousness, which we will get to eventually, as well as Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, which we may look at, had appeared, giving the desire for a reconstruction of Marxist theory using social scientific theories and techniques a strong impetus. During the early years before the formulation of the project of a critical theory of society and the program of the Frankfurt School, the research conducted at the Institute was geared toward providing a theoretical alternative to both social democracy, with its real political orientation, and a Western alternative to the theory that informed the Soviet experiment. The objective was to create the context for developing a systematic analysis oriented towards identifying the necessary social, political, and cultural preconditions for a successful proletarian revolution. Under the leadership of its first director, Karl Grünberg, the research conducted at the Institute was directed towards the condition of the working class and the labor movement. It was not the Institute's purpose to develop a distinct critique of capitalism within the tradition of Marx's critique of political economy. While during its early years the activities and successes at the Institute were not especially noteworthy, the circumstances changed profoundly when Max Horkheimer, a professional philosopher, was chosen as the new director of the Institute in early 1931. With Max Horkheimer at the helm, the definition of the Institute's purpose underwent a major transformation. Horkheimer brought a new impulse to the work conducted at the Institute and pursued a new program that shaped the research agenda for decades to come. To Horkheimer, The research objective was precisely to update Marx's critique to considerably altered socio-historical conditions. The issue was no longer the critique of political economy in the sense of the accumulation process and its intricacies, but the critique of political economy, that is, the relationship between state and economy. To develop a sophisticated and systematic critical theory of advanced capitalism as post-liberal capitalism, two necessary steps had to be taken. First, the problems and promise of this socioeconomic formation needed to be examined in terms of how the underlying contradictions of capitalism had changed and how new opportunities for societal transformation had arisen since Marx had developed his theory. And second, in the process of analyzing post-liberal capitalism, the question had to be answered, does the critical analysis of this new formation, on the basis of Marx's critique of political economy, reveal flaws in Marx's theory itself? To analyze the new social formation in the most rigorous fashion, Horkheimer regarded it as essential to draw on advances that had been made since Marx's death in the theoretical and social scientific understanding of capitalist society. To be as social scientific as possible and heeding the increasing division of labor, to integrate Marx's unsurpassed critique directed at overcoming capitalism's contradictions needed to be integrated with contributions made by the social sciences as an explicitly collaborative effort. This critique of political economy was to be the foundation for the more important cultural critique of capitalism, a social scientifically more refined version of Lukács's critique of reification that would consider the actual socio-historical circumstances and the potential for social transformation it entailed. In other words, what appeared in Marx as critiques of alienation, political economy, commodity fetishism, and what had been intrinsically entwined in Marx's own theoretical work appears in the Frankfurt School in a different constellation to be understood in terms of the division of labor. In this sense, the Frankfurt School critical theorists followed the pattern of Hilferding and Lukács, where the critique of political economy and of alienation/commodity fetishism had fallen apart. Different members of the Institute were responsible for analyzing different dimensions of post-liberal capitalism. At the next stage, the pieces were to be recombined by Horkheimer and his colleagues. One question is not just of current relevance, but indeed the contemporary version of the oldest and most important set of philosophical problems, namely, the question of the connection between the economic life of society, the psychical development of individuals, and the changes in the realm of culture in the narrower sense to which belong not only the so-called intellectual elements such as science, art, and religion, but also law, customs, fashion, public opinion, sports, leisure activities, lifestyle, etc. The project of investigating the relations among these three processes is nothing but a reformulation on the basis of the new problem constellation, consistent with the methods at our disposal, and with the level of our knowledge of the old question concerning the connection of particular existence and universal reason, of reality and idea, of life and spirit. In terms of the objective of developing a systematic critique of advanced capitalism, not one comprehensive systematic theory, though, but to engage in a collaborative project working towards an open-ended critique of capitalist society, the main theoretical impulses came from the works of Marx and Weber. Although the contributions of other predecessors, especially Hegel and Freud, played important roles as well for the trajectory of Frankfurt School critical theory, Marx and Weber were most central. Despite basic similarities between Hilferding's analyses, the Lukács of history and class consciousness, and an array of works attempting to grasp the transformation of capitalism underway during the 20s and 30s, the specific critique put forth and developed further by the Frankfurt theorists is unique. Though they saw their theoretical project in the tradition of Western Marxism, their simultaneous embrace of social scientific standards in general and their rejection of some specific standards in particular constitutes this critique's most distinguishing feature. The theories of capitalism presented by Hilferding, Lukács, and the Frankfurt School theorists can all be compared in terms of their relationship to the theories of Marx and Weber. The appeal of Hilferding's structural analysis, and even more so of Lukács's critique of reification, was expressive of the promise derived from linking Marx's theory of historical materialism, emphasizing the challenge of analyzing the changing mode of capitalist production with Weber's writings on rationalization. Now, while the Frankfurt School's theorists' interest in Hilferding's analysis of finance capitalism remained rudimentary, Lukács's reformulation of Marx's critique of alienation and commodity fetishism in terms of reification, which corresponded to conditions of advanced capitalism fostering commodity fetishism as second nature, provided a major impetus for their own development of a critical theory of capitalism during the Great Depression. Hilferding's economically oriented analysis of finance capitalism seemed to have fewer implications for the kind of cultural criticism that guided most Western Marxists, including the Frankfurt School theorists. While recognizing in principle Hilferding's importance for Marxist analysis of early 20th century capitalism, they did not regard his approach as central to their analyses. In addition, Horkheimer and his colleagues started out from the assumption that since our understanding of society is itself shaped by society, there is a special need for a critical theory that does not reproduce the patterns of the social formation it is designed to elucidate. To achieve this objective, critical theorists must first identify the conditions that would have to be fulfilled for discerning an understanding of advanced capitalism that opens up, rather than closes off, future possibilities of qualitative social transformation. The vanishing point, as it were, for such a critical theory would have to be a qualitatively different critique of political economy, because the state-economy relationship had changed, because the analytical and research tools had become more varied and more refined, and because the historical goal may have changed. Along the lines of this strong emphasis on an institute organized on the basis of social scientific principles, Horkheimer posed his agenda in terms of an overall division of labor. For Marx, the critique of political economy was and had to be central to an integrated behavior where one element attained primary significance in relation to all the other elements, and where analysis and critique, theory and practice were parts of an integrated whole. Now, by contrast, in Horkheimer's vision of the Frankfurt School of Social Research, the analysis of different dimensions of modern capitalist society was to be the responsibility of individual researchers within the Institute's division of labor, while it was the responsibility of the entire staff to facilitate the most powerful understanding of advanced capitalism. The members of the Institute of Social Research engaged in the critique of capitalism on two levels. On the first level, they saw the need to revitalize the later Marxist critique of political economy to be applied to the stage of capitalist development reached at the end of the first third of the 20th century. Heeding the continuous division of labor in the social sciences, Horkheimer determined that the members and affiliates of the Institute be responsible for specific tasks, that is, for sociology, psychology, economics, or law. Since each of the social sciences pursues a different analytical and theoretical agenda, Horkheimer argued the critical theorists had to presume the relative autonomy, that is, the inner logic in Weber, of the social sciences' respective tasks, and of the dimensions of social life, that is, value spheres in Weber. These sciences are designed to analyze. Only on this basis would it be possible in a later step to critically relate the different inner logic to the prevailing patterns of how these tasks are fulfilled in actually existing societies. Along these lines, the task of providing an updated diagnosis of the state of political economic affairs along Marxian lines fell to Friedrich Pollock, while the overall purpose of the Institute was to generate a highly sophisticated systematic critique of post-liberal capitalism and its effects on political, social, and cultural dimensions of life. As Sayla Ben Habib has pointed out, the research program at the Institute of Social Research evolved in three phases from the 1930s to the mid-1940s. From the explicitly collaborative beginnings oriented towards the integration of philosophy and science via a philosophical critique of the epistemological bases of the sciences to the culturalist critique of Western civilization, which may have ended, as Elon Musk said, with the election of Judge Crawford last night in Wisconsin. Sorry for that. The initial phase of interdisciplinary materialism, 1932 to 37, was followed by the phase of critical theory proper, that is 1937 to 1940, to culminate in the critique of instrumental reason of 1940 to 1945. The middle phase of critical theory in the more narrow sense began with the publication of Horkheimer's essay, Traditional and Critical Theory. As Ben Habib put it, Horkheimer argued in this article that the findings of the specialized sciences cannot be integrated with philosophy without the latter exercising a critique of the foundations on which the sciences are based. Both the specialized sciences and those philosophical theories which consider their achievements to be the only valid model of knowledge perpetuate an epistemological illusion. The object of cognition is presented as a ready-made, ahistorical reality, and the relationship of the knowing subject to this object is presented as one of passive cognition or limited experimentation. Traditional theories question neither the historical constitution of their own object, nor the purposes to which the knowledge they produce is put in society. Now, this distinction between traditional and critical theory is especially pertinent with respect to economic theory. The critique of political economy in the Marxian sense entails a philosophical dimension facilitating three types of insights. First, the core concepts of economic theory are self-contradictory in terms of their logical implication. They are not capable of explaining the capitalist mode of production. Secondly, the critique of political economy emphasizes the fact that capitalist society is not an objective, law-governed, nature-like sphere, but socially constituted. And thirdly, the critique of political economy exposes the internal contradictions and dysfunctionalities of the system in order to show how and why these give rise to oppositional demands and struggles, which cannot be satisfied by the present. To put it differently, the logic of the social sciences in capitalism is itself a manifestation of the effects of capitalism. The theories of capitalism are epiphenomena of capitalism, not theories of it. They're reflections of capitalism, not reflections on it. The traditional theory, see Peter Drucker, the traditional theories of capitalism from Smith to 20th century neoclassical economics are also not critiques of it. Capitalism shapes the way we think to such a degree that we cannot help but reproduce its defining features and core patterns, even in our theories of it, like in free competition or free trade. In this context, Weberian Marxism is the project of analyzing the logic of capitalist production and development, which leads from liberal capitalism to various forms of post-liberal capitalism, bureaucratic capitalism, managerial capitalism, finance capitalism, and beyond, to a totally administered world. In the process, the contingencies of an increasingly complex socio-historical reality are reduced to means-ends relationships. Critical theorists were interested in the relationship between the inner logic of capitalist production at the stage of post-liberal capitalism reached during the 1920s, and the early 1930s, and the different logics of other spheres of life in society which become increasingly oppressed, enslaved, or altogether eliminated by increasingly sophisticated capitalist organizations for which there is no match in society. See wage slavery. Under such circumstances, the need for a systematic critical theory, as opposed to traditional neoclassical economic theory of economic organizations, as well as their relationship to the state in post-liberal capitalist society, became all the more urgent, since anything but a systematic critique was bound to merely reflect rather than reflect on this society and its corresponding mode of capitalist production. In essence, Pollock's task was to accomplish for the 1930s what Hilferding had achieved in 1910, namely to provide, quote, a study of the latest phase of capitalist development, unquote, as Hilferding had subtitled Finance Capital, the book. However, while the latter had not claimed to have presented the analysis of a later stage of capitalist development that constituted a qualitatively different political, economic, and socioeconomic arrangement, Horkheimer and Pollock started out from the assumption that the political economy that emerged during the 1920s, and especially during the 1930s, called for a different type of critique. On the second level, which turned out to become the core concern of the critical theorists, the critique of capitalism took the shape of a social, philosophical critique of Western civilization in the spirit of Marx's critiques of alienation and commodity fetishism. Lukasz's reconstruction of Marx's critique of alienation within the framework of Marx's later critique commodity fetishism in terms of reification prepared the Frankfurt theorists' critique of capitalism in terms of their critique of instrumental reasoning. Section 4, and I'm not sure whether we will get to Section 5. Well, we'll see. Section 4, Pollock's concept of state capitalism. In 1930, at the very end of the final volume of the so-called Grunberg Archive, Pollock published an extended review of 5 books on socialism, progress, competition, and the end of capitalism. In this review, Pollock raised an issue that was novel at the time, but whose importance has become increasingly apparent as the century progressed. Can we adequately analyze the logic of economic decision-making processes in society if we employ theoretical analytical categories as the basis for the analysis that derive from and are designed for microeconomic problems and conditions? And those of you who attended the critical theory writing group or reading group discussion, there was this distinction made between macro and micro analyses, which may not have been quite squared away. How realistic are such micro-based analyses once the predominant form of economic organization shaping economic decision-making processes are no longer based on individual utility considerations and the reference frame of small to medium-sized firms? That's, the standard micro course. Pollock raised this issue in his discussion of 2 of the books, Gustav Kassel's Socialamus oder Fortschritt and George Holmes' Die Concurrence. Kassel had praised the model of free competition and remained the prime mechanism by which to solve the economic problems of the early 20th century, a view whose validity Pollock questioned. In his discussion of Holmes' book, Pollock returned to this issue. Holmes had claimed that despite all weaknesses, the free capitalist economy of competition is the best of all possible constitutions of the economy, implying that the industrialized economies of continental Europe had ceased to be free market economies if they had ever been free to begin with. Pollock formulated the challenge for a systematic analysis of the economic affairs of the time. The question of whether a system of monopoly capitalism has replaced the competitive system today can only be resolved by means of an unprejudiced analysis of the economic facts from the second half of the previous century to the present. Given Pollock's contention, he himself might have taken up the challenge of engaging in such a systematic study, since the members of the Frankfurt School place themselves squarely in the tradition initiated by Marx's critique of political economy. The rigorous analysis of the developmental stage of the capitalist economy reached at that time might have been of central importance to the Institute's agenda. However, as it turned out, neither did Pollock pursue this line of research, nor was the emerging research orientation at the Institute conducive to a critically systematic analysis of yet another latest stage of capitalist development in Hilferding's sense. Indeed, such the focus on the economy as the most central aspect of modern Western societies following Marx was replaced by an interest in the emerging relationship between, yes, the economy and the administrative state, from which Steve Bannon gets his attack as a quasi-reference to Frankfurt School in his little agenda. After Horkheimer became the director of the Institute of Social Research in 1931, Pollock continued to function as co-director. Since 1927, as the deputy of Horkheimer's predecessor, Carl Grunberg, Pollock had been the chief administrator and in charge of day-to-day operations. With Horkheimer as the Institute's leading theorist and Pollock in charge of administrative matters, his academic work remained secondary to his administrative responsibilities. In concrete terms, this meant that as the only person explicitly in charge of engaging a structural analysis of advanced capitalism within the Institute's overall division of labor, Pollock was not in the position to make a full-time commitment to that task. It is not surprising, then, that compared to the research and publications produced by the Institute's other core members during the 1930s, Pollock's output was rather scarce. According to Vigerhaus, Pollock published altogether 3 books and 9 articles. The first book addressed Sombart's purported repudiation of Marxism. The second examined the attempts in the Soviet Union to establish a planned economy during the decade following the Russian Revolution. Both books appeared as publications of the Institute of Social Research. He published 6 articles during the time period covered in this chapter, all in the Institute's official outlets. During the 1920s, Pollock had placed high hopes in the success of the Soviet experiment. He had visited the Soviet Union in 1927 and returned with a most favorable assessment of the particularly unfavorable conditions which the Russian revolutionaries had faced at the outset, their tremendous continuing difficulties, the often glaring mistakes they had made, and their constant changes of direction and frequent reorganizations, as Vigerhaus put it. In Pollock's related book, based on his experiences, he expressed his confidence that he had proven that a socialist planned economy could work, as he was mostly concerned with whether a planned economy in general could work rather than a socialist economy in particular. He left open the possibility that a non-socialist, authoritarian type of planned economy might work as well. He did not assert, however, that the Soviet experiment as such led to any necessary conclusions about the viability of a planned economy, since, according to Marx's theory, a successful socialist takeover of the economy by the state was contingent on a high level of development, which had not been reached in Russia in 1917. For this reason, as far as Pollock was concerned, the Soviet case had no bearing on the possibility of a socialist planned economy as projected by Marx. Pollock's perspective on capitalism in the 1930s and 40s is laid out best in the articles De Gegenwärtige Lage des Kapitalismus and State Capitalism, published in 1932 and 1941, respectively. Pollock's theory of advanced capitalism was clearly influenced by Hilferding's writings and developed in its early version under the impression of the Great Depression and before the rise of National Socialism in Germany, 1933. Well, yes, technically. His study on the present state of capitalism, published in the Zeitschrift in 1932, the year before Hitler's ascension to power, circumscribed the condition of capitalism as monopoly capitalism, a view that is immediately embraced by the Institute. At this time, his interpretation of capitalism was not exposed to further critical scrutiny. Pollock posited as fact the overall tendency of capitalism to facilitate the formation of ever larger units of economic organization and to force an ever greater role for the state in economic matters. In his view, this entailed the progressive suspension of markets. Important economic decisions were being made at ever higher levels of economic and administrative organization, ranging from monopolistic corporations to the administrative state. Under such circumstances, planning increasingly subverted markets and brought about the end of liberal competitive capitalism and the advent of state capitalism. The urgency of developing a theory of advanced capitalism was heightened when Hitler and the National Socialists took control of the German government in early 1933, inducing the members of the Institute to leave Germany. They arrived in New York in 1934 after stopovers in Geneva and Paris. The Institute's analysis of the specific meaning of the capitalist mode of production thus continued under exceptionally pressing circumstances that called for research oriented towards analyzing the transformations of the economy underway at the time. As the 1930s progressed, the political and economic success of the National Socialist regime became ever more apparent. Pollock's immediate response was that developments in Italy under Mussolini, in Germany under Hitler, and in the US under Roosevelt were indicative of a qualitatively new stage of political economy in capitalism, to which he referred to as state capitalist intervention. See tariffs. He assessed the prospects of capitalist planning as viable and promising. Horkheimer initially had considered this new development a temporary return to an authoritarian form of government. By 1940, however, Horkheimer agreed that the rise of authoritarian regimes like National Socialism was not an aberration in the logic of capitalist development, but a necessary consequence under conditions where capitalist production had created its own potential nemesis, that is, the Great Depression. Accordingly, the rise of authoritarian regimes had to be theorized in terms of capitalist categories. As Figurehouse put it, Horkheimer held that the epoch of liberal capitalism must be conceived as a process which made a spiral of lasting despotism possible by atomizing human beings and producing large-scale companies and gigantic organizations. In a controversial article Pollock published in 1941 entitled State Capitalism, Its Possibilities and Limitations, he drew out the implications of this analysis. Theoretically speaking, Pollock identified as the Archimedean point for analyzing capitalism the ideal-typical concept of state capitalism. He asserted that state capitalism had constituted the vanishing point for analyzing advanced capitalism for some time, reaching its peak in National Socialism, though a trend in this direction could be observed elsewhere as well. The most central feature of state capitalism was the suspension of the market mechanism in economies dominated by large corporations. In state capitalist societies, the primacy of the economy characteristic of liberal capitalism had been replaced by the primacy of the state. Pollock introduced a set of crucial distinctions. First, there are four aspects of the new economy that are better explained in terms of state capitalism than of designations that presume the primacy and relative autonomy of the economic sphere, such as state-organized private property, monopoly capitalism, state-organized private property monopoly capitalism, managerial society, administrative capitalism, bureaucratic collectivism, and others. The four aspects are state capitalism as the successor of private capitalism, that is, the state assumes important functions of the private capitalist. Profit interests still play a significant role, and it is not socialism. Number four. The main features of Pollock's article thus are related to the question of how private capitalism had been succeeded by a non-private, public form of capitalism. Since the medium-sized businesses that had dominated the industrial economies of the later 19th century had been replaced by monopolistic enterprises during the early decades of the 20th century, the categories developed for analyzing 19th century political economy as well as its Marxian critique had become outdated for the political economy emergent during the early 20th century. As a result, the very pertinence of such core categories and distinctions of economic theories as market versus planning, private versus public, itself had to be questioned. Pollock did not provide a clear economic argument as to why the larger size of businesses mattered, independently of its implications for the market/planning and private/public distinction, but he did argue that with the rise of monopolistic economic organizations, the administrative state had become a central economic player. State capitalism can appear in two forms, totalitarian or democratic. Depending on which form of government is in place and which social groups control it, the nature of state capitalism can vary greatly. Since the economic process has become fully manageable, the important question is, toward what end will it be put? What is the capitalist economy being administered for, and who administers it and distributes its product? For what end? Since Pollock's and Horkheimer's emphasis was on the politics of advanced capitalism, they did not directly address how exactly it is that managerial capitalism produces economic growth and development, nor how it mediates people's conceptions and perceptions of the world. Although the interorganizational dimension of the economy is touched upon, it is only peripherally addressed in its relationship to culture. After all, reaching a new stage of capitalism, if it was indeed the case, would have important implications for the theory of capitalism and modern society, for the possibility and direction of social change, and for our understanding of society and the basic concepts we employ to organize society meaningfully, such as freedom, self, individual, and emancipation. Noting that today is Liberation Day. In the context of his depiction of the new set of rules, Pollock did draw a definite distinction between market capitalism as an economy where men meet as agents of the exchange process, as buyers or sellers, as opposed to state capitalism as a system where men meet as commander or commanded, as will apply in particular to the working population in general. But again, Pollock skirts the issue of the inner logic of economic production as well as distribution by asserting that in state capitalism, the profit motive is replaced by the power motive. Though Pollock should have considered whether and under what circumstances the level of productivity achieved during the early 20th century in the most advanced industrial societies could be maintained once large corporations were subject to state supervision and regulation in state capitalism, he did not do so. Instead, he presumed that once those high levels of industrial production had been reached, they would not be negatively affected by a shift of society's economic planning function from monopolistic corporations to the state. The above mentioned 5 new rules are: number 1, a general plan gives a direction for production, consumption, saving, and investment. Number 2, prices are no longer allowed to behave as masters of the economic process, but are administered in all important sections of it. Number 3, the profit interests of both individuals and groups, as well as all other special interests, are to be strictly subordinated to the general plan, or whatever stands in its place. Number 4, in all spheres of state activity and under state capitalism, that means in all spheres of social life as a whole, guesswork and improvisation give place to the principles of scientific management. And finally, number 5, performance of the plan is enforced by state power so that nothing is left to the functioning of laws of the market or other economic laws. Project 2025. Pollock further elaborated the implications of these new rules in sections on the control of production and distribution, respectively. Again, he asserted that in state capitalism, there no longer will be a need to heed the inner logic of the economic process. The entrepreneurial and capitalist functions are being interfered with or taken over by management and the government, or AI. Though production and distribution facilities will continue to be privately owned, control of the cartelized industries and its enterprises will be with the government. Pollock also presented arguments for why there can be an adequate incentive structure for a state capitalist system, why the separation of price and production will not hurt the latter, why the state capitalist system does not need to suffer from the kind of wastefulness and inefficiency characteristic of market capitalism, and why economics as a social science will lose its object. Now, who will control the state and state capitalism? Will there be a new ruling class of key bureaucrats in the business, state, and party allied with the remaining vested interests? Elon Musk. The capitalists of old will lose any necessary social function. Instead, the free professions and those owning small and medium-sized businesses will play a role. The majority, salaried employees, are subject to the leader principle of command and obedience. The new state will appear as what it is, the embodiment of power and the instrument of the ruling class. Finally, Pollock asked whether a non-totalitarian democratic form of state capitalism can function. If our thesis about state capitalism proves to be correct, he wrote, society on its present level can overcome the handicaps of the market system by economic planning. Some of the best brains of this country, that is the United States, are studying the problem how such planning can be done in a democratic way. But a great amount of theoretical work will have to be performed, indeed, before answers to every question will be forthcoming. Economics as a social science becomes superfluous. Pollock was so convinced of the empirical superiority of his model over market capitalism that he did not contemplate viable or desirable alternatives, nor the relationship between the existing contradictions of capitalism and the potential for qualitative social transformation. Since state capitalism was capable of covering up and domesticating class conflict and social inequality by means of full employment, see Keynes, these non-progressive forms of social, political, and economic organization even was capable of managing the danger of social and political eruptions resulting from its underlying economic contradictions. For this reason, as well as its economic superiority, Pollock regarded state capitalism as a social formation that, once in place, could continue to exist for a long period of time. While the earlier article had been an example for the kind of work conducted at the Institute during the initial interdisciplinary materialist phase, the latter article was published at the turn from the critical theory phase to the period that brought about the most pessimistic critique of instrumental reason. It is important to note that during the intermediary phase, when the Frankfurt School spelled out the differences between critical theory and traditional theory, they did not consider the implications of their new perspective for the conflict within mainstream economics waged during the second half of the 1930s. The traditional neoclassical economic theory based on the marginal utility paradigm that had been prevalent up until then experienced its first major challenge from the new paradigm for economic theory proposed by John Maynard Keynes in his general theory of employment, interest, and money. Keynes called for an explicit and direct role for the state in economic policy towards sustaining or generating the conditions for continued economic growth, especially under the conditions of worldwide economic crisis, the Great Depression. Though Pollock's analysis was closely related to the analyses of the stage of capitalistic development characteristic of what has been referred to in the literature variously as managerial capitalism, corporate capitalism, organized capitalism, monopoly capitalism, and more generally post-liberal capitalism, he did not expend much energy on the rigorous critical analysis of political economy in the sense of an analysis of the intricacies of corporate capitalism. In his view, the logic of capital accumulation of the latter followed closely the patterns characteristic of liberal capitalism and thus did not call for a thorough revision of the mode of analysis in Marx's critique of political economy, nor whether and to what degree the categories of classical economic theory Marx had criticized still were viable. As a result, Pollock's analysis was not a critique of political economy in the Marxian sense. On the one hand, Marx's critique of political economy was presumed to continue to apply despite the fundamental transformation of entrepreneurial capitalism into managerial capitalism that had occurred since the late 19th century, even though Marx's theory did not provide the means for the systematic analysis of the latter. On the other hand, as the Frankfurt School theorists, including Pollock, were not in the position to systematically analyze managerial capitalism on the basis of a radical revision of Marx's critique of liberal capitalism designed for post-liberal conditions, they were concerned rather with the indirect manifestations deriving from the shift from one organization of the capitalist production process to another. Since for the Frankfurt theorists, the traditional classical economic theory had been proven wrong by Marx, they did not see any need to relate its 1930s version to the challenge of developing a critical economic theory of managerial capitalism. Nor did they consider the implications deriving from the historical coincidence of the managerial revolution that began during the early century and the Great Depression of the 1930s for the development of a critical economic theory and how it had eroded the empirical adequacy of classical economic theory regarding the inner logic of the functioning of the market mechanism under conditions of organized capitalist production. Further, they did not consider how Keynes's statist response bore on the theoretical understanding necessary for grasping the inner logic of managerial capitalism and for political, social, and cultural forms of life in modern society. Instead, the critical economic theory of capitalism developed by Pollock and appropriated by his colleagues abandoned the notion that the inner logic of the economic process needed to be theorized positively in order for the specific nature of its negative consequences and their historical situatedness and significance to be identified adequately. The theoretical critique they developed moved beyond the challenge of systematic economic analysis altogether and posited that in post-liberal capitalism, it was not the inner logic of the capitalist production process that warranted attention, but the relationship between the economy and the state, hence the need to develop a critical theory specifically designed for identifying the nature of this relationship, and its effects on all aspects of society. In the experience of the Frankfurt theorists, with the entrenchment of National Socialism in Germany and of the New Deal in the United States, the urgency of analyzing emerging state capitalism as a qualitatively different system of political economy no longer could be ignored. To be sure, given the relative lack of an infrastructure conducive for focused economic analysis at the Institute, Pollock was in a poor position to take on the challenge of updating Marx's critique of political economy for post-liberal capitalism on his own. Needed an army of graduate students. Yet, already, when Pollock's manuscript on state capitalism circulated at the Institute, one of the other members examining macro institutional change, that is, Franz Neumann, a reformist theorist of monopoly capitalism, entered the fray on whether and in what sense National Socialism could indeed be regarded as the closest approximation of state capitalism, as Pollock had claimed. In his major work, Behemoth, oh, yes, this is Neumann's book. Behemoth, the first comprehensive study of National Socialism, Neumann rejected Pollock's analysis and proposed instead the concept of totalitarian monopoly capitalism. Despite significant similarities between their respective diagnoses pertaining to increasing bureaucratization and organization, there were profound differences as well. In particular, Neumann insisted that the market process had not been suspended in National Socialism, and that instead the market process exposed the Nazi government to tremendous economic and financial pressure. Neumann argued that the capitalist mode of production continued unabated, albeit in a highly organized, integrated, and state-coordinated fashion. He wrote that the antagonisms of capitalism are operating in Germany on a higher and therefore a more dangerous level, if these antagonisms are covered up by a bureaucratic apparatus, see concentration camps, and by the ideology of the people's community. Does the economic theory of National Socialism coincide with the state capitalistic doctrines? The answer is no. There's no National Socialist economic theory except the slogan that general welfare is more important than self-interest. A slogan used to cloak almost every economic decision. We can find as many economic theories as there are groups, grouping, within the National Socialist Society. The National Socialist economic system does not follow any blueprint, is not based on any consistent doctrine, be it neo-mercantilism, any guild or estate theory, or liberal or socialist dogma. The organization of the economic system is pragmatic. It is directed entirely by the need of the highest possible efficiency and productivity required for the conducting of war. Yeah, labor camps. At the time, in a letter to Horkheimer, Neumann wrote, "For a whole year I've been doing nothing but studying economic processes in Germany, and I have up till now not found a shred of evidence to show that Germany is in a situation remotely resembling state capitalism." Similar concerns were voiced by Adorno, who rejected the affirmative tone of Pollock's depiction of state capitalism. Even Horkheimer himself had reservations despite his decision to support the publication of Pollock's article on state capitalism. The difference between state capitalism and totalitarian monopoly capitalism, which for the argument's sake I will refer to as authoritarian capitalism, even though Neumann does not seem to have used the term, is more than nomenclature. Pollock's term places greater emphasis on the state than Neumann as far as the inner logic of the economy is concerned. To the former, state capitalism signifies a qualitative transformation expressing the shift of society's economic planning function from the economy to the state. In Neumann, by contrast, the economic planning function continues to be held by large corporations in Germany during the Nazi period, many of which actively supported the Nazi regime, using politics to secure favorable business conditions. Moreover, he asserted that Pollock's vision entailed, and unless you think that's unimportant, people have had very terrible arguments. I think it's was it Turner or Tucker debate over Nazi capitalism. But anyway, Moreover, he asserted that Pollock's vision entailed nothing less than the end of history, like some other people, and the destruction of any prospect for future qualitative social societal transformation. State capitalism and authoritarian capitalism both constitute more openly cooperative forms of business government relations. In this respect, I'm almost done. The difference is mainly one of emphasis, especially if we consider that Pollock's concept of state capitalism had to be understood as a ideal-typical model. State capitalism places greater emphasis on the state, authoritarian capital on the economy. The more important difference, however, relates to the theoretization of the inner logic of the economic process itself. According to Pollock, the inner logic of capitalist production is secondary to understanding the politics of state capitalism. According to Neumann, the inner logic of capitalist production and its understanding remains central. The nature of authoritarian capitalism cannot be discerned without a sophisticated grip on the inner logic of the economic process under changing conditions and its relative independence from the state. Yet the Institute members, most of all Horkheimer, were more interested in the general similarities between Pollock's and Neumann's respective diagnoses. Now, I'm nowhere near the end. Um, and as you can see, there's more to read, and that would probably take us another 15 to 20 minutes of yammering here. But I hopefully you get the point that there are distinctions and some reference to Pastone even. Clearly, the clearly the flaws of traditional Marxism identified Pastone or by Pastone are far less manifest in Neumann's thinking and work than in Pollock's. Neumann did, after all, analyze capitalism from both the distribution and the production side. His reformist perspective on the critique of political economy was also more complex than the critique of capitalism from the point of view of labor that would have allowed for. In this sense, too, Neumann was more of a Weberian Marxist than Pollock, since Neumann insisted that critical theorists must confront the nature of the relationship between the economy and the state as an empirical question instead of is scrupulous examination its scrupulous examination on the basis of theoretical prejudice. His perspective may be of great value for the development of a critical theory of the inner logic of social value spheres. Now, that leaves us at a very weird moment and worth reading the discussion, but I'll leave that to others. Let me heretofore look at if there's any questions or comments. Oh, there's a big difference between reification and valorization. Reification is, making things more static, is to try and solidify things, whereas valorization is producing value, greater flexibility or dynamism. Reification is a reductionist activity, I would assert. Yes, better than Bill Maher, and indeed. So I've gone over time, as you can tell. I will thereupon stop the live stream and return you to your regularly scheduled activity. Tonight, I assume there's going to be, and John's here, so he can perhaps, I guess, or is Bruce going to talk about it? Whatever, John, I guess, talk about spirituality and activism, which should be later.